Hello, welcome to Planetside Chats. We're a video cast focused on vintage science fiction. I'm your host, Will Emmons. Today we're going to be talking about some contributions by Margaret St. Clair to the magazine Planet Stories, and about Stanley G. Weinbaum's posthumous novel, The Black Flame, first published in January 1939's issue of Startling Stories. Let's start with Margaret St. Clair. Now, when we talk about Margaret St. Clair, there's three things we have to say that are obligatory. One, she was a Wiccan. Two, she was a nudist. Three, she had a master's in classics. Now, I think only one of these things matters to the stories that we'll be talking about today. When you dig into the commentary about her, usually it says that she's pessimistic or cynical compared to other SF writers of her time. And it's true that if you're in one of her stories, something bad is about to happen to you, but I feel like she has a dark sense of whimsy. And in 1985, she wrote that the historic task of science fiction is to create a global consciousness, which I feel like is more optimistic than the kind of view of science fiction that it prepares people to be scientists and mathematicians, and they're going to bring forward a better future that way. A global consciousness, I think, is something that's a lot more ambitious than creating an army of people who know how to use a slide rule. Just my opinion. Anyway, let's dig into these stories by her. The first I want to talk about is The Flowering Evil from the summer 1950 issue of Planet Stories. I don't have a copy of that to wave in front of your face, but I'm sure you can find one online if you're savvy about where scans are. And this story is cozy in a Little Shop of Horrors kind of way. I think the story is optimistic, actually, which is, if you take the commentary seriously, it's different than some of her other stories. The main character is a woman named Miss Dinsmore. She receives exotic plants from her nephew Robert, who is a spaceman on a freighter. And she has a new plant from Venus, and she's friends with this retired space captain named Hjalmar Bjornsson, and he's warning her against the new plant. He's reminding her of all these times that Bob has sent her plants that have done something bad to her. Oh, like, she's had an allergic reaction or something. And he's kind of disparaging Bob in general as being a good kid, but kind of like a doofus. And Miss Dinsmore just will not hear these things about her nephew, who is always interested in her hobbies, dotes on her, cares about her soap carving, and these sorts of things. In fact, she's preoccupied with trying to figure out what she's going to cook for her nephew when he comes to town. So that's how the story starts out. Gotta have coffee. Now, the story heats up when she starts to have nightmares that are really bothering her. In fact, they're so bad that she considers seeing a mental hygienist. Then she starts finding dead animals around her Venusian hothouse, the place where she keeps her plants from Venus. They don't do well in a Terran climate. You have to keep them in a special hothouse. So that's kind of disturbing that she's finding these dead animals, and they're like grisly dead animals, like just some bones and some skin, like not a whole animal. She considers asking her friend Bjornsson to help her address the dead animal problem, but she thinks that he'll like be too much to deal with if she asks for his help, and decides to wait for her nephew to come and ask him for help with the problem. Then she realizes that it's been a while since she's carved soap, and she wants to have something to show her nephew when he comes to town. So she's carving soap, trying to imagine just what she's going to cook for dinner when her nephew comes to town. And real detail is put into this story with thinking about cooking. Miss Dinsmore is thinking about how electric cooking is easier and as nutritious as old-fashioned cooking, but it just doesn't taste the same. So there's this real culinary element going on, Meanwhile, she's getting hypnotized by this plant of hers while she's carving a flower out of soap. And she finds herself drawn into the hothouse. She's still got the soap in one hand and her carving tool in the other hand. And the plant sticks an appendage into her arm that's described as being similar to a hypodermic needle. And it's getting ready to draw her blood and consume her when she comes to her senses and throws a piece of soap into the mouth of the carnivorous plant. Now, it may be an important detail that the soap is authentic soap. It's real soap. It's not synthetic soap. It may or may not be an important detail, but authentic cooking and authentic soap are really important to our protagonist in this story. And the experience of almost getting eaten by this plant makes her realize what kind of meat she wants to cook for her nephew. It's something called bolo meat. I Googled bolo meat, and it doesn't seem to be a real thing. Must be a science fiction invention. But anyway, that's what she settles on, is bolo meat. And then we get a scene where her nephew has come to dinner, and in his sort of, oh, by the way, kind of way, he's like, that plant was carnivorous. I meant to send you a postcard from XYZ port, but I neglected to do that. And she just says nonchalantly that the plant died and she had to throw it out. Which, I don't know. So it turns out that Bjornsson is sort of right about this nephew. He's flighty, and he sent her this plant that is dangerous, but she doesn't care. And she's not been changed by her encounter with something alien. She's maintained her priorities. It's real cooking, real soap. She's a heroically static figure. And I think there's really something to that that I like about this story. And it's very funny. The bit about seeing a mental hygienist, that's, I think we could all use one of those. And that was The Flowering Evil from the summer 1950 issue of Planet Stories. The next story I want to talk about is The Inhabited Men from the September 1951 issue. I actually have that here. He's got a cover story by Ted Sturgeon that we might do on a future episode if I keep doing these and you all are very good. And this story was republished in an anthology by the Library of America called The Future is Female, as being sort of symbolic of Margaret St. Clair's work. Although my opinion is that the story doesn't totally work, and it's not really like the best example of her work. That said, everything that happens in the story is like kind of interesting. So let's go through this story. It's kind of interesting, and maybe we'll enjoy it. 3 spacemen land their damaged spacecraft on an unlucky planetoid. The spacecraft is called the Ara, and this is where Margaret St. Clair, having a master's in classics, might be relevant to what we're talking about here. She never names a spaceship on accident, and I was able to use Google to figure out that Ara is Greek for like a curse, like as in cursing. So this damaged, stalled out spaceship is called Ara, as in we're swearing about it. And through hard work, they're able to repair the spaceship well enough to get it out to a major space lane and have it stall out there. Once they do that, they're rescued, but they're financially ruined because their ship is claimed as salvage by their rescuers. They're not able to get a loan to get another ship, and so they have to split up. And from there, the story goes 3 ways, and we learn how it turns out for each of these guys. This first guy, Norton, gets a job on a freighter. he's a superstitious guy, and he shares quarters with this native cook named Gongo, and so Norton is superstitious and Gongo is religious, is what we learn. Initially, Gongo gets the top bunk, but there's a fresh air vent there, and Norton, being the bigger man, decides that he can steal the top bunk and not have consequences from that. And when he's clearing out the top bunk and stealing it, he finds this little statue or little carving of a god underneath Gongo's pillow, and being a superstitious guy, it freaks him out, and he throws it away. And Gongo asks him about it, and being able to physically intimidate Gongo, Gongo can't do anything about it. But maybe he shouldn't have done that to Gongo, because one night Gongo hears voices coming from Norton in the dark, and I'm just going to read this little bit of the story. Thea, came a thread, a wisp of sound. Do you hear me? Why not? And I. Isn't it wonderful? Came the first filament. To live, be free, grow, expand. I warn you, Thea, Poem, Rhea, all the rest. You grow too far. It is dangerous. You grow too far. The wisp of sound managed to sound harsh. How can we help it? It is difficult to refuse to grow. You must try. No excuses. It must be done. The half-dozen filaments of sound swelling into a tiny clamor in the dark. Led into a tiny clamor into the dark. So, Gongo hears that, and it freaks him out. He wakes up Norton and is like, hey, you're talking in your sleep, and you're talking with different voices. And he's thinking about, his lost god and, quote, the various disguises the devil can assume. So once Norton falls back asleep, Gongo got one of his kitchen knives out from under his mattress. He opened Norton with it from pubic bone to diaphragm. It was a mistake for Norton to have gone back to sleep. So that's kind of cool. Nice graphic death scene there for Norton. And what happens to the other astronauts? So next we have Evans. He gets a job on a luxury liner. He's got this thing for the stewardess on the luxury liner. He's imagining, what if we were married? Maybe we could get something called a semi-house that had a nice kitchen. Then there's an explosion on the luxury liner, and there's only 3 survivors. This guy Evans, the stewardess, and one of the passengers all managed to get into spacesuits and float in the space lane, hoping to get picked up. The catch is there's only 12 hours of oxygen in the suit, and it's going to be 6 days before a spaceship comes along, which feels like a real design problem with the safety equipment, I feel like, on this luxury liner. Anyway, while they're floating there, about to die, Evans tells the stewardess about his feelings and how he wants to get married to her and have a semi-house, and she, of course, feels the same way, but they succumb to lack of oxygen, except for the time passes and Evans finds himself still alive somehow. The other 2 are dead, and that freaks him out, so he kills himself with his blaster. Okay, kind of a neat story. Alright, so we get to the 3rd spaceman, this guy named Miller, and he ends up really hard up uh, he's not able to get a job on a freighter or a luxury liner or any kind of spaceship. He ends up working as a bouncer at this like messed up theater called the Royal Glory, and they show what are called pornographic tactifilms and sentimental patriotic movies. He works for this guy named Quilk, who's a native and like a health nut, and is always doing some kind of different dieting craze each week. This is when the Green Plague strikes the port, and they're considering whether to close the business or not. This guy Quilk, on the one hand, he's afraid of the Green Plague, but on the other hand, he doesn't want to close his business, so he decides that his business is too important to close, and gives Miller the job of checking people for green spots in their mouth, the sign that they have the Green Plague. And so Miller does this, and the plague comes and goes, and Quilk is really proud that he didn't ever have to close his theater during the plague. Then one night when they're settling up, he sees into Miller's mouth, and he sees that he has these green spots that are growing in his mouth, and that's when he really freaks out and is like, "You're fired, Miller. Get away from me. I'm a health nut. I don't want to get the Green Plague." And so Miller is demanding that he settle up with him before he leaves, and so Quilk is tossing coins at Miller, and Miller's saying, "Hey, this isn't enough," and keeps approaching him. So Quilk pulls a blaster on him and kills him. And so that's the end of Miller's life. So everybody dies in kind of a bad way, I feel like. This is, I think, where we get into Margaret St. Clair as a pessimistic writer. These are bad ways to die, in my opinion. But we get 3 paragraphs at the end of the story that explains, what's going on. Why is Norton talking in his sleep? Why is Evans able to survive without oxygen? And why does Miller have these green spots inside of his mouth when it doesn't seem like he has the Green Plague? And I'm just going to read these 3 paragraphs. The organisms that had colonized the crew of the Ara died with them, naturally. They were able to survive for considerably longer than the men, but the knife wound and the blaster charges disrupted their nicely balanced economies beyond repair. What they had done as they grew on the men's mucous membranes and in their body cavities was to convert Norton and Evans and Miller into Wardian cases, terrariums, units in which chlorophyll and radiant energy, it did not have to be sunlight, cooperated to turn the carbon dioxide of catabolism into oxygen, complex starches, and growth. After the economy was well established, its hosts, had they known it, were potentially immortal. They could have gone for years without needing to eat or breathe, but the plants in a Wardian case die when the case is broken, and the tenants of Norton and Evans and Miller, for all their complex mental organization, were basically plants. They were not in the least resigned to dying, however. For hours they fought against it, screaming to each other, imploring, cursing, praying not to die. In the end, Evans and Miller and Norton had this in common, that each of them kept on talking for a long time after he was dead. That's pretty cool. Pretty chilling end. They keep talking after they're dead. But I don't know if the story totally worked as a one story with a single through line. I might have talked myself into it in the telling, but if I were choosing a Margaret St. Clair story for The Future is Female, I probably would have chosen something else. Even from her Planet Stories catalog, she's got some other stories that are worth checking out. I'm going to name a few of them because there's this other podcast you should check out that has done episodes on Margaret St. Clair and Planet Stories that are really good. There's The Garden of Evil from summer 1949. There's Meme from fall 1950. And there's The Dancers from January 1952. And for each of those stories, there's an episode of Reading Short and Deep, which is good. My friend Jesse and then Professor Eric Rabkin talk about those stories in detail. And then she's got one more story in Planet Stories called The Vanderlark, also from January 1952, that if we get a request for more Margaret St. Clair, I might do on here. So let's talk about Stanley Weinbaum. Stanley Weinbaum is famous for a story called The Martian Odyssey, which exploded the idea of how we should treat aliens in science fiction. Before The Martian Odyssey, you had aliens that were basically like human beings, but they were from a different planet. You might be an egg-laying princess from Mars and be basically human, except for that you're from Mars. And what Stanley Weinbaum did is imagine a creature that was as smart as a human, but not human in the way that it thinks. So that's his big contribution to science fiction in The Martian Odyssey and its sequel, Valley of Dreams. Stanley Weinbaum is kind of a tragic figure. He died when he was 35, or maybe younger than that. But I guess he died in 1935 of lung cancer. Really, as he was beginning to flourish as a writer. So we missed out on a lot of stories by him. But people worked to publish him posthumously after he died, both in fan publications and professionally. And so the story that we have for you today is from the January 1939 issue of Startling Stories, which I do not have a copy of. I read it in this anthology of Stanley Weinbaum stories. And it's a tale of the far future. There's two things going on. One, it's a far future story, and two, it's a story about love triangles. I'd like to be more focused on the far future aspect of it than the love triangles aspect of it, because I think that works better. We'll see how successful I am at talking about that. I want to say this story is influenced by Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, but where Edward Bellamy is writing a socialistic story about what a reform movement might think the future should be like. This is more idiosyncratic, and I don't necessarily think we should believe that everything in this story is something that Stanley Weinbaum wanted to come true, because it's about a cast of immortals on top of a surveillance state ruling all of humanity. But there's some sci-fi stuff in here and some eugenics stuff in here that feels like the idiosyncratic desire of a person. So we'll talk about that. And the reason why I say it's influenced by Looking Backward is the structure of the plot and the biographical information that we do have about Stanley Weinbaum. We know that he believed that Looking Backward was a really good example of science fiction, and that science fiction had actually gotten worse between when he was active and when Looking Backward was published. So what's the structure of the plot of this story? We have this guy named Tom Connor. He's being executed in the electric chair. You assume that this is in the early 30s when Stanley Weinbaum would have been writing it. Tom doesn't care that he's about to die. he has killed a man who was uh, sleeping with his lover, and he just is like, okay, I'm ready to die now. Um, but this being a science fiction story, he doesn't actually die. He wakes up 1,000 years later through this made up process called electrolepsis, which in the far future, they have a process by which you electrocute the brain just right, and it causes you to go into suspended animation rather than die. And just by accident, this is what happened to Tom Connor. So he laid in his grave in suspended animation for 1,000 years before being rescued by these people, including a woman named Ebony, the sorceress, who is a scientist, and a guy named Jan Orm, who is an engineer in this little town of people that he is adopted by when he comes out. I'd like to spend the next little bit talking about just this idiosyncratic future that is created, and we'll talk a little bit about the plot of the story too while we're talking about the future. But I do think that this story works more as just a, hey, check out this neat stuff, than as a novel with a plot, because the plot goes to some places that are not great, I don't think. So what is this future like? Everything is nuclear powered. That's powered by nuclear fusion on a super local level. Every town has a nuclear powered factory, and they have all these nuclear powered devices. Every town is able to make whatever it needs, except for the big equipment that they use in agriculture, which it's easier to transport the completed equipment than it is to transport the big parts of the equipment to build. So that's kind of neat. That's very sci-fi. We can use nuclear fusion. It's totally safe. It totally works. Good sci-fi thing. That's not that idiosyncratic, but then we get into other aspects of the future. Something that this future empire has done is it's made it a lot more pleasant to go to the forest, because there's not as many stinging or biting insects anymore. And how did they accomplish this amazing feat? Well, it's all about balancing the ecology correctly. They released a parasite called the fellophage, which killed off all of the cats. And by killing off all of the cats, they stopped the birds from getting killed by cats. And so the birds were able to eat all of the stinging and biting insects. And that way, the forest is more pleasant to be in. And this feels like, one man's idiosyncratic view of the future, rather than, normal sci-fi geekery. So I don't know. So that's pretty neat. And so the English language is different in the future too. I'm gonna bring up a section of the novel that explains that. He meets this woman in the forest who turns out to be an important character in the story later. And the woman in the forest explains to him that languages evolve by laws. Here's one. Consonants tend to move forward in the mouth as languages age. Take the word mother. In the ancient Tokar, it was makar. Then the Latin mater. Then madre. Then mother. And now our modern word mother. Do you see? And she's explaining that language has evolved more quickly because after this apocalyptic war that took place in the 20th century, it was released from the bonds of printing, and people were able to talk however they wanted to. and so that's why English is different in the far future. I mean, so that's, cool and kind of scientific. And this lady explains to our protagonist uh, how the second Enlightenment came out of New Orleans, after 2 centuries of barbarism. They rebuilt the utilities for the city, and then this guy named Enar Olin, who also appears in another story called Dawn of Flame, rediscovered atomic energy, so they were able to get the utilities going in New Orleans again, and it attracted these guys who, 700 years later, are still ruling the world. This guy named Martin Sayre, who invented immortality. This guy named Joaquin Smith, who is the ruler of the world, and his sister Margaret of Herbs, who's called the Black Flame, and is secretly this woman who's telling him about all these things, and is the titular character of the novel. So there's immortality, which you get by using hard radiation on bodies. There's this powerful social science that Joaquin Smith has created, using the neglected social sciences, government, economics, psychology. And because he was immortal, he was able to spend 60 years conquering America, and then went on to conquer the rest of the world, and even went on to conquer Antarctica, and just did all this stuff. So Tom is really impressed with this guy, even though the people who've been taking care of him in this little village are all opposed to the regime. They want to overthrow it, even though they don't really have a good chance of that. Tom helps them build these nuclear fusion powered guns, since they can't use gunpowder because of a super science reason. And he's going to help them in their revolt, even though he thinks that maybe that this Joaquin Smith guy is actually okay. And he finds out other cool things about this era. They've turned the Sahara Desert into a lake, essentially, and made Tripoli and Algeria countries that are fertile. They've built an observatory on top of Mount Everest, and they've accomplished moon flight. And the empire, despite being the ultimate surveillance state, is very permissive. When people revolt against it, most of the rebels are not lined up against the wall and shot. Every once in a while, a leader of a revolution is killed, but mostly people are just let go, because the regime is too powerful to really be touched. And Joaquin Smith actually likes most of the rebels on some level, so that's kind of interesting. This is where the story gets into the love triangle stuff. The attempt at a revolution fails just like on its face. It's like miserable, and through a series of events, Tom and Ebony end up in captivity in the city of Herbs. Joaquin Smith is going to kill Tom because he's too smart to be allowed to live, but then Margaret, the Black Flame, kind of intercedes on his behalf, and it starts off this weird relationship between them where Tom loves Ebony, but Margaret loves Tom, and then Tom is like, oh, I love Ebony, but every time I get alone with Margaret, I kiss her. Also, Margaret is obsessed with trying to frighten me, so takes me up in her space rocket and, like, says, I'm 700 years old and ready to die. Let's fly directly at the Pacific Ocean and see what happens, and then pulls up at the last moment. So it's, there's some healthy relationship dynamics going on here. Um, of course, when it becomes clear to Ebony that Tom is kind of in the pocket of Joaquin Smith now, she's no longer interested in him, and she turns to Jan, the engineer from the small village who's in the palace now pretending to be a servant. And then Ebony plants an atomic bomb in the throne room to kill the master and kill his sister. And, the bomb doesn't end up killing anybody, but there's this messed up scene where Margaret is safe from the bomb where she is, but Tom doesn't know that, so he runs through danger to get to her, and Margaret doesn't realize that Tom loves her, so she takes him back into danger, or lets him take her back into danger where they'll both die, because she wants Tom to love her. And it's just, that's the plot. Anyway, the story ends up with everybody is forgiven for for the atom bomb being set off in the palace, and Jan and Ebony are going to get married, and Tom and Margaret are going to get married, and Margaret's going to become temporarily not immortal so that she can have babies by Tom, and, all's well that ends well. And, I think the story really worked better as an idiosyncratic view of the future than as this story about what it's like to be with an immortal princess. Because it seems like pretty bad to be with an immortal princess if she's going to, fly her rocket into the ocean on you. Because she's, 700 years old and, is feeling willful. One thing I wanted to say about this, that I'm not sure if this is how to read this, but it's something that sticks in my craw, and this is written in the early 30s before Stanley Weinbaum's death, published 1939. Here's Joaquin Smith talking about, his eugenics program. Moreover, I've preserved what differences I could. The yellow race was a remnant. I've bred it strong again. The red race has gone, but the black is growing, and the tag-ins of nations, I've nourished them. And that's I think that's supposed to be an optimistic and progressive statement. I mean, I think it's pretty cruel to say the red race has gone, and it's sad too. And it's pretty offensive to say the yellow race was a remnant. He kind of doesn't say anything bad about the black race, but that just feels like an accident. And I don't know if this represents Stanley Weinbaum's personal views on things, or this is just what the immortal emperor of a surveillance state has to say about eugenics. But nobody had a comment on it in the letter column of the issue of Startling Stories that followed the January issue. I read through the letter column of the March 1939 issue, and it was all just unabashed praise for the story and its plot, and just, there's no replacement for Weinbaum. People are really sad that he's gone. They think he should be added to the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, and they're calling for reprints of The Martian Odyssey and Dawn of Flame. And, I definitely sympathize with the sentiment. I think Weinbaum was a really good writer. I've called myself a Stanley Weinbaum guy in the past, and I probably will in the future. But the eugenics in this story is we have the benefit of hindsight to see where that goes. I mean, they were always like cruel and bad when implemented in the United States, and when they were implemented in Germany, well, we know what happened there. So I think that the eugenics stuff kind of mars this story of the far future. I wish it would have had more of the far future in it and less of the like here's what it's like to be with an immortal princess in it, because I think that was just stronger material. And maybe that is about the kind of science fiction that I like to read instead of the kind of science fiction that somebody else likes to read. Maybe, another reader would say, hey, it's great to have this story about an immortal princess. I'd really like more of the scene where she takes him to a strange dinner party and nobody's allowed to eat anything because she only picks at her salad and you can only eat what the immortal princess is eating. I mean, that's like a cool detail, I guess, but it's not super sci-fi, I don't think. Um, anyway, I appreciate people spending the time with me today, and I think that about wraps it up for the Black Flame. What I would recommend in terms of getting into Weinbaum is reading The Martian Odyssey, reading the sequel to The Martian Odyssey, Valley of Dreams, and if you are attracted to this far future with immortals in it, I think Dawn of Flame is probably a better story than The Black Flame. And that about sums it up. Leave a comment, hit me up on Twitter, and have a good night.